Welcome, everybody. Great. If you want to unmute yourself and if you want to say hi, test your audio, we're going to be kicking off here. That's my football analogy. I know nothing about football. Kicking off in 1 minute.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good to see everybody.
Hello.
How's it going?
Is this
Hi there.
working?
Hello.
Is my audio working?
Yep, Robert, we can see you.
Good. Thanks.
Good to see you all.
Good to see everybody.
Good evening from Bellingham.
Good evening.
I'm trying to be quiet so my dogs don't think I'm here. They think I left.
Great. All right. So we've still got 1 minute before kickoff. I'm going to keep using that football analogy tonight. And Brent, you can also let me know when I have 6 o'clock, so let me know, Brent, when we are ready to get started.
We are good.
Okay. Excellent. Well, welcome everybody to Tuesday night's third learning session for the Washington Climate Assembly. We are going to be meeting today from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. as we've been doing for the past couple of Tuesdays. I almost said Thursday, but it's actually Tuesday today. Great to see you all. It's really fun to see folks' faces and just see all of your names trickling in. And we are going to kick this off as we've done other times. In just a moment, I am going to turn it over to Mike to walk through tonight's agenda as well as our learning objectives for the night. Before I do that, I do just want to take a moment, as we've done the past couple of learning sessions, if you in the chat can share just how you're feeling at this very moment, how you're feeling, whether it's about today's meeting, whether it's just in this moment, this is how you're feeling. We would love to hear in the chat if you can just share with us where you're at in this moment.
Good shape, ready to go.
Great. And as these come in, I'll just read a few. We've got a hello from Cliff, hello from Juan, hello from Puneet, Jason from Seattle. Electric issues, PUD's coming to check it out. Good luck with that. Got Nate saying focused, feeling good, motivated, feeling good, excited, good, curious, planning, tired. And again, take care of yourself through these next couple of hours. If you need to get up, if you need to grab water, please do so. Ready, tired, pumped, happy to be here, tired tonight, anxious to hear from our presenters. Hungry but ready. Grab something to eat if you need it.
I just had a cheeseburger.
Okay, good job.
Yeah.
Good evening. Feeling great, get her done, excited. And it's somebody's birthday today. Happy birthday, Rich. Happy birthday. And thanks for spending your birthday with us. That's true commitment, right?
Happy birthday.
For a while. Great. Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see many of your faces, and thank you for sharing where you're at. And we're going to be doing this at the end as well, just to see where you're at the end of our meeting as well in the chat box. And now's a great reminder for folks, if you can just take a moment to mute yourselves at the moment. And I'm going to read through our land acknowledgement and then just a couple of tips before I turn it over to Mike to get us grounded in our agenda for the night. So we wish to acknowledge that the people of Washington State live and work on traditional lands of the indigenous people who've been here since time immemorial. There are 29 federally recognized tribes, 7 non-federally recognized tribes within the boundaries of Washington State. Tribes and tribal people bring thousands of years of traditional knowledge to our present moment. Tribes bring an important and vital voice to the current conversation, and we honor our tribal relations. So, and now going to take a moment to remind folks that haven't had a chance yet, and welcome to those that just joined. I know folks are continuing to trickle in and will likely do so over the next few minutes here, but if you haven't had a chance yet to rename yourself, if you can do that and just hovering over your name and clicking on the more, it will give you the option of renaming yourself. And we are asking all assembly members to have your first name, comma, location for presenters to have your first and last name, comma, presenter. For the coordinating team, ourselves, we've already done that, but our full names and then coordinating team. And then we do have a couple of observers that are joining as well. And so first and last name, comma, observer. And we'll be helping as folks join as well. We'll be helping folks. And in just a moment, we are going to put, I'm sure Brent at this time is a familiar face and a friendly face with all of you. Brent Edgar, our IT person, here to help you if you do have any issues throughout this call today and any issues really throughout the course of the assembly and our time together. Please give him a call. We're putting his contact information in the chat if you want to just write that down, recognizing if you have a connectivity issue, you may not see his name and contact information in the chat, but write it down somewhere and keep it close. Every one of us will likely have a technical issue at some point in our time together. So making sure that we've got support for that. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Mike to walk through tonight's agenda.
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you, Gretchen, for kicking us off. So tonight's agenda, this again is looking familiar to you, but we just wanted to review the agenda again. So we're just going to provide a welcome to introduce today's topics and speakers. We'll then recap of how you can provide feedback, as well as an overview of how we've incorporated your feedback between the last learning session and this learning session. Again, recognizing and responding to the fact that this is your climate assembly. So we just want to make sure that you're getting the most out of this assembly as well. Tonight, we have a lot of speakers, and because of that, presenting a diversity of topics. And because of that, we've actually divided the speakers tonight into two parts, a part 1 and a part 2. And we're going to have some small great breakout groups around the campfire time at the end, where we'll have the same breakout groups that we had over the past couple of learning sessions to process and share out reflections. And then we'll review next steps as well. So I wanted to take a few minutes to review what we heard from the last learning session as a brief overview of and a reminder of the many things we're learning throughout this. So we had multiple experts and interested parties presenting about the environmental considerations of climate change, climate impacts, and climate mitigation solutions. We heard from Dr. Mead Crosby, Paul Williams, Brandon Letzinger, and Dr. Jessica Holofsky about the variety of climate impacts to a diversity of ecosystems and habitats within Washington state. We also heard from Dr. Holofsky, Jessica Randall, Julianne, and Zephyr about the potential of natural ecosystems and habitats to be a critical component of the climate mitigation solution. And finally, we heard from Heather Trim and Jason Steinberg about how to connect environmental solutions with other sectors, thinking about sustainability issues from a waste and a green roof perspective, and how these solutions, especially those upcoming in the state legislature, can continue addressing the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So continuing to build on the different types of learning sessions we have. So we've learned the introductions of climate change. We learned some of the social considerations, the causes, and some of the impacts of climate change to the communities of Washington state. We learned climate impacts and the potential for climate solution from the environmental perspective. And today we're going to learn about some of the economic issues and how they relate to climate mitigation. In today's meeting, in today's learning session, specific objectives we have is we want you to learn about the economic considerations of climate change and climate solutions, including the cost of inaction, what happens if we don't do anything, and creating more sustainable economies and businesses from multiple experts and interested parties. We'll also learn about the potential climate mitigation solutions using economics and carbon pricing solutions, which we'll hear again from multiple experts. From the previous slide, and I think one of the comments that we got is more defining what an expert means and what an interested party means. So experts are individuals who specialize in the subject of the assembly, in this case, climate change and equity and its impacts and solutions by profession, education, training, skills, or experience, and whose role is to transfer that knowledge to the assembly. Interested parties, on the other hand, is an organization, an institution, or an informal group whose activity is related to the subject of the assembly and is directly affected by issues raised during the assembly. Interested parties present more of a personal or a subjective opinion to the assembly, also in a means to educate people of where they are coming from. And finally, before we transition over to the presenters, we're currently about halfway through our learning sessions. And so we thought this was a good time to again remind you of the reason why we are all here, to deliberate solutions to this question we have posed here. How can Washington State equitably design and implement climate mitigation strategies while strengthening communities disproportionately impacted by climate change across the state? So as you listen to each of the presenters during today's learning session and all of the learning sessions, please keep this question in your mind and continue thinking about what sort of recommendations may help answer this question. Each of our presenters are sharing their insight and at times their recommendations with you, and this is a great lens to work from. We'll of course be diving into the recommendations during our deliberative sessions, but we thought we again wanted to remind people of the central question as an important guide for you as you listen and ask questions and digest the information that you're learning today. So I'm going to turn this back to Gretchen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. And as we've done the last couple of times too, just reminding you all of the various different ways that you can provide feedback and input, and that this truly is your assembly. And as this slide will look familiar, hopefully to you all by this point, one way, submitting questions to presenters, and that we'll be doing in real time throughout the course of the presentations and the learning sessions via the chat function. But you can also submit questions to the members' email at any time as well, and we'll be sure to get those to presenters in advance of the presentations or after. A deeper dive into any topic, please let us know if there's a particular topic that you feel like, man, I really wish I knew more about that, and we just scratched the surface in the learning session. I want to dive more deeply into that. Let us know. The other is the independent research, which I talked about. If there's an article that you come across in your own time, and again, this is not a homework assignment by any means, but if there's something that you come across or you want to do your own independent research at any time throughout the learning sessions, has something you'd like to share with your fellow assembly members, please share that with us and we will share it with the rest of the assembly. And then the general feedback after each session. And just like we did on Saturday, we'll be putting in the link directly into the feedback form. Last time there was a bit of a glitch, but we fixed it quickly. This time there won't be, and we're gonna put that in the chat. You can click right over to it, just spend a couple of minutes. It's a quick survey, and it just really helps us know what we need to pivot on and where we need to improve to make your experience even better. And as I mentioned last time, we read these. We really truly read these every single time, every single piece of feedback that we're getting, and we work in the suggestions that we've heard. And so as I did last time on Saturday, and I'm going to do right now, is going to share with you, based on some feedback that we heard on Saturday, some of the pivots that we've made to tonight's meeting. And one of them was, there was a question in the feedback form about the difference between experts and interested parties. And so we provided that reminder about the difference. And when I introduce each of the speakers, I'll let you all know if they fall into the expert category or the interested party category. Trying out a new way to let presenters know that they have 5 minutes left and 1 minute left. We had heard that it was a bit disruptive, and I absolutely agree for me to jump in there and give folks the 1 minute warning. So we're pivoting on that. We've got a new system that we're going to try out tonight to let presenters know where they're at and how much time they have left. We're building in more time for Q&A. We also, in just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy, who will be introducing you all to a file sharing folder that includes a glossary and some other relevant materials that different presenters from past learning sessions have shared with you. It'll really be your resource library. You can use it as makes sense for you, but we wanted a single central place to share all of the information that was coming your way throughout the course of the learning sessions. Another thing, we did ask about technology and how technology was working for you all. And a few folks indicated that there were some kind of stumbling blocks related to Zoom. So Brent was able to reach out to a few of you and provide some additional support to help resolve some of those issues so that those folks can participate more fully as well. And then we've added learning objectives to each of the meeting packets, and we've posted them to the project website as well. We've been sharing the learning objectives by presenter during the meetings, but wanted to make sure that those were also featured in the meeting packets, both past meeting packets as well as any future meeting packets that we have. And the final piece was relooking for this week, at least from the feedback that we got on Saturday, was relooking at the flow of presenters and to see if anything needed to be moved around. And just full transparency from you all, it definitely is like a puzzle and kind of fitting all the pieces together. And sometimes presenters' availability doesn't quite match the flow that we were going for. So we're doing what we can and working within the presenter availability as well. But really appreciate all the feedback that folks provided and encourage you all to just take a couple minutes after each assembly meeting and let us know how it's going. Let us know what additional things that we can pivot and improve on to make this the most meaningful experience for you all possible. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Wendy, and she's going to share her screen for just a moment and introduce you to this resources folder. And so if you can, Wendy, let me know when you're ready, and I will turn it over to you. And she's ready to go. There's her face. Okay. Thanks, Wendy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Gretchen. So I'll just go over this really quickly so we can get started. But we put together this Google Drive folder for you all to view some of the resources that we mentioned and also past presentation materials. So when you get onto this page, you'll see this how to use this folder page. You can click on that and it just has the nice, well, it's loading, a nice guide on what's included. So as you click through these pages, you can find previous agendas, which also include bios and abstracts and also additional presentation material. You can see previous presentation PDFs if the presenters had chosen to share that with us. You can see illustrations from our lovely Anne, who is doing some visual representations of these meetings. Presenter Q&As, those are additional questions and answers that presenters provide written answers to, and we'll add those in as folks give them to us. So not everything is in there yet. After I finish speaking with you today, in just a moment, I'm going to send you all an email with a link on how to get onto this file. Please remember that this file is for you and you only. Don't share this link with other folks. Some of these materials were given to us by presenters to share for your eyes only. It's their work, it's their livelihood, so please don't distribute those materials. And I'm going to put a link to the folder right now. And also, I am going to send you an email so you have that link in your email. Thanks so much, and I'll hand it back to you, Gretchen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And in there as well, the lights keep going out on me. In there as well is a glossary, as you'll see at the bottom here, and we'll be adding to that throughout the assembly. And if there's a word that you want to add to that too, it's an editable document. So yeah. And if there is anything that isn't in here that you think would be useful to you, then please let us know. And with that, without further ado, we are going to roll into our first set of presentations. And as Mike oriented us to tonight, we are going to hear from 3 presenters, have a Q&A, and then hear from the rest of our presenters. So we'll have 2 sets of question and answer periods. And our first presenter for the night is Matt Steuerwalt, and he will be presenting on the economic costs of climate change as an expert. Matt is a partner at Insight Strategic Partners and a teaching associate professor at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. He was Governor Jay Inslee's policy director, Governor Chris Gregoire's energy and climate advisor, and worked for 7 years at the Attorney General's office. The learning objective through Matt's presentation is to learn about the costs of climate impacts, disasters, and inaction. Thank you so much for being here, Matt, and welcome.
Thank you, Gretchen. I think everyone should be able to see my screen. Wendy, can you just give me yep, great. I know we have very little time and this is a lot of material, so I will go fast and I apologize in advance for doing that. But I think this will be enough just to ground you in what people think about the cost of action are, what they think about the cost of not acting are, and what those choices look like. If I can get my screen to move, it would be great. All right. So what does the cost of inaction look like? We can agree that all of these things cost us money, whether it's Australian bushfires or Superstorm Sandy or the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which is sort of a gift to us from the last ice age, right? Which is, if it melts all the way, is going to raise sea levels and cause us to spend a lot of money on adaptation. The costs of not acting on climate change are substantial and real, and they're starting to be felt now.
And Matt, just quickly, are you able to click on presenter mode to make your slides bigger? It's if you go to the way bottom here.
Let's see, the way bottom of what? Sorry,
of your screen. Yep, and see the little sliding bar at the bottom that makes things bigger to the far right. Yeah. Yep. So if you can click on presenter, it's gonna make everything bigger there.
Is that better? Great.
Yes. Thank you.
You bet. This chart is sort of the impacts of climate change in 5 key areas and in natural, managed, and human systems. If you think about it, basically when it gets purple, the impacts are severe. When the impacts are severe, the costs are expensive, right? And this is a great chart from the International Panel on Climate Change, which I'm sure other people have talked to you about, but this is basically, what do we think the impacts will be at different changes in temperature? And you can see the impacts start to get more severe as you go over 2 degrees Celsius change. There are a couple ways you might think about the costs. First, you could think about sort of the precautionary principle, right? What do we want to spend to avoid any of those bad impacts we just looked at, right? A second way of thinking about it is maybe the same way that people think about home insurance, right? I want to buy enough insurance in the event that my house burns down, but I really hope not to use it. So I'm just trying to figure out how much insurance is necessary to do that so that I avoid those worst sort of catastrophic damages. The third way is the classical economic way, right? Where you're sort of trying to figure out what's the right amount of money to spend so that the benefits are just slightly better than the costs. It turns out that's a complicated calculation. There are a lot of inputs and outputs to that. One way to think about it, and the way that a lot of studies have sort of come up with over the last 15 years, because there have been a lot of studies, most people find the costs of acting to be equal to about 1% of gross domestic product, sort of the 1% of the economy. People find the cost of not acting to be somewhere around 5 to 20% of those same costs. So a much bigger order of magnitude. So why don't we just do that? Well, because the inputs and the assumptions are very complicated, right? So the most sort of thorough and comprehensive study of this was Nicholas Stern, who did this for the British government several years ago. Huge costs in the long term. Other people looked at that and said, well, you know, look at Professor Stern's inputs and he's just overestimating this. You should really do modest taxes of $2 a ton. And when you hear from people later tonight talking about the policy responses, have that $2 number in your head. People have looked at what the costs at the national level are and come up with wildly different conclusions. We ran the same exercise for Washington State 15 years ago. And again, people said, well, there'll be huge benefits or maybe there'll be huge costs. How does that, they come up with different ideas? They're using different methods. They're making different assumptions. They're using different discount rates, and we'll talk about all of those things, and they're including different things in the scope of their analysis. So the one thing I would leave you with here is, if people are showing you a study that shows you lots of benefits or lots of costs, you want to look into that and ask questions about what's included in the study. When you look at this sort of benefit cost program, there are lots of things that might be benefits, right? All of those avoided storm damages, all of the non-market benefits, right? The loss of human life or loss of species extinction, all of the sort of benefits that might come from warming, right? Being able to grow pineapples in Wenatchee, whatever you might think of those benefits are, against the costs of taking action here. So all of those studies should have some sense of this kind of information to be really useful. You'll hear later tonight, I think, about various tools for putting a price on carbon, and why isn't that just a good enough policy response? Like, that's the economic sort of solution to these kinds of questions, right? Is to just make it so that the costs of the activity really reflect the long-term costs and the costs of climate change. Again, looking at the Stern report, you need both pricing, technology policy, and you need to make it easier for people to do the right thing. This chart on the right-hand side is just a chart of the current level of carbon pricing that is found in different states and countries, right? You will see that mostly they are quite low, right? They're like in that $10 a ton, $2 a ton, $16 a ton. If you ask economists what the right price for carbon is, they will tell you that mostly it depends on what impacts you're trying to avoid. But if you really want to avoid those longer term impacts, you're going to need a much higher price than this. Why does that matter? So some of the costs to mitigate the most dire impacts of climate change are expensive, right? So solar photovoltaic panels on your house have come down a lot in price. They used to be really expensive. They're getting cheaper. Electric vehicles are still more expensive than a normal gasoline-powered car. And then, of course, for those of you who are long-term residents of Washington, this is one of the 5 proposed nuclear power plants for Washington that never ended up getting built because the cost ballooned really high. So it's not that what you do to avoid the damages or the costs is cost-free in itself, right? So some things you have to think about. Are you spending money either, again, on that insurance idea, or to avoid, the worst damages, the precautionary principle, or are you trying to level out the benefits and costs? You have to think about the costs of acting as well. A quick example, President Obama, in his second term, developed a plan for reducing emissions that his EPA concluded would have these net benefits of $25 to $45 billion, right? A lot of those benefits were from reducing the other emissions associated with emissions from power plants, right? The human health benefits, a bunch of the improvements to energy efficiency. And because climate change is a global problem, they were thinking about the global benefits. When the Trump administration came in and repealed that, on the right-hand side, they claimed to be saving $33 billion from not doing the same set of actions, right? So there's 2 wildly different answers, right? This is $25 billion better, or it's $33 billion worse. And what's in there, if you think about it, is all of those assumptions we talked about, right? The scope of the analysis, how they value those non-market benefits like pollution, healthcare, how they discount the future. So whether those benefits occur right away or occur a long time in the future, right? So just an example to give you a sense of, what should I be looking for when people are talking to me about what the benefits and the costs are? Just a quick thing about why this is difficult to do. Oops, sorry. We'll talk about the intergenerational equity issue a little bit more, but this is basically a question of, do your actions help you now? Do they help your children? Do they help your grandchildren? And how do you decide, as between those places or 7 generations into the future, how to value those benefits that come a long time from now? There are a bunch of other challenges in here about whether the economic model has enough information for you to make a good choice about your actions and your particular responses to this. You should leave this sort of 15 minutes thinking there's a ton of value to good economic analysis. And because we don't have unlimited resources to devote to climate, and we have other priorities too, that you're going to need good economic analysis to help you think through your choice. But you might need other tools to help you think through the choice as well, right? Because the economics won't do all of the things that you want it to do. A quick note on that intergenerational equity piece. So discount rates are the way that economists quantify this issue. I'll just put this all up here now. Basically, you're trying to figure out if you want to prevent $1,000 of damages or costs 100 years from now or 200 years from now, how much did you spend today, right? In theory, if you could get the investment right today, you would spend the right amount of money and you would avoid those long-term costs in the future. And you wouldn't spend other money because you could save that money to spend on other issues that you thought were equally important. If you use a high discount rate, like a 7% discount rate or a 6% discount rate, it basically means you're tilting the balance towards emissions reductions way off in the future. And a low return means that you'd want to start taking action now. Maybe a simple way of thinking about this is, imagine I was going to give you $50 today or $50 next week. You probably don't really care very much as between those two things. Maybe you want it today because you want to spend some money on pizza. Maybe next week because you know the grocery bill's coming, but you're probably fine either way. What if it was $50 today or $1,000 in 100 years? Right? Which would you choose? They're the same thing if you use a 3% discount rate, right? That present value of $1,000 in 2021 is like having $52 today. Most of you, I'm guessing, would take the $50 today because you'd have some questions about whether you were going to be around in 100 years to spend the $1,000. And you might have questions about whether I'd be around in 100 years to give it to you. Well, that's the intergenerational question at its heart. Are you willing to spend your money today for significant benefits down the road? And it really matters how you think about this because, as the last bullet point says, when you run the economic analysis, you can get to active climate policy with a 1.5% discount rate, but a 6% discount rate means you probably don't need to do very much today. Here's more on the argument. I will only say there's a lot of reasons to pick a side on either piece of this. Just to go back to our example, the Obama administration used a 2%, 2.5% discount rate in quantifying those $40 billion worth of benefits. The Trump administration used a 7% discount rate. Nicholas Stern used a discount rate of 0.1%. What that did was, for all of his 20% of the costs of climate change, it put all of those benefits out into the out years. I know the economics is a little difficult to swallow all at once. I apologize for all that. Here's what you should leave with. There are real and substantial costs to not acting today, maybe 5 to 20% of the economy. A lot of those benefits for taking action come 100 years from now. So if you want to act, you have to be prepared to act and have other people be the beneficiaries. And the costs of those actions are all felt by you right now, right? You have to spend the money to get the benefit later. Even if they're small, say 1% of GDP, you pay them now and they're not equally distributed. Some people will pay more than other people. So thinking about how you value the future will inform how much you're willing to spend to avoid those dangerous climate change impacts. Thanks for the time. Really great to see you. Happy that you all are engaged in this process.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And we are going to take just about a 30-second pause between presenters before I introduce our next presentation for the night. Okay, our next presenter is Moji Egan, and presenting on the circular economy and opportunities for climate action as an expert. Moji is the founder of the Blue Daisy consulting firm, small and medium-sized businesses. Moji is certified as a true zero waste advisor and enjoys drawing connections between zero waste and the broader spectrum of sustainability. She is about this. And now I'll turn it over to you, Moji. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. So the circular economy and opportunities for climate action is a topic of this talk, and I'm going to distill a lot of information, just like the last presentation, into a short amount of time. So I will try to speak clearly and as articulately as possible. So what we are going to talk about today is learn about what the circular economy is, understand its potential to reduce carbon emissions, and then I'll give you some opportunities for Washington State to implement this in practice. So first, whenever I talk about the circular economy or anything to do with waste, I like to show this comic because it succinctly brings what this concept is in one picture. So if we think about materials and waste, everything that we buy from the store, whether it's Walmart, Target, Amazon, local co-op, wherever you shop, eventually a lot of that stuff ends up in the trash and further than that in the landfill. And so this is a problem because, as we all know, we live on a finite planet with finite resources, so we can't continue to move in this pattern forever. It's unsustainable. So where we are now is what's called a linear economy. And an easy way to remember what the linear economy is 3 words: take, make, and waste. So essentially, we take things from nature, whether it's mining things from the earth or harvesting softer materials, we make them into goods and products. And then eventually, after we're done using them at their end of life, they become waste. And so we have this very linear system that we've been doing for years now. And it's causing a problem because we are kind of using up all of our resources faster than the earth is able to replenish them. So what we're trying to do with the circular economy is transition away from a linear economy, the take, make, waste, through a recycling economy, which we are experiencing now in certain materials, so paper, cardboard, metals, we recycle those kinds of things, plastics. And we're trying to get to a circular economy where we design systems in our economy into a point where we're not throwing anything away. That's the ideal scenario. Of course, it won't be perfect, but that's the ideal situation. And so I just explained circular economy in very basic terms, but this is a more detailed diagram of what the circular economy looks like. This is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is one of the leading orgs in this kind of research. And so I want to explain what this diagram is saying. On the left, you'll see a bunch of green arrows kind of circling around, and that represents biological material flows. So biological material flows are materials that can be returned to the earth through biological processes. This is thinking about, for example, composting your food scraps. That can be returned to the earth through biology. On the right, you'll see circular flows in blue, and those circular flows are technical material flows. And those are things that can't be returned to the earth through biological processes. So thinking about the power drill in your garage, things that you can't just throw into nature and they'll return to earth. So we have these 2 material flows that are creating these circles, and that forms the circular economy. 1 more thing to note, or 2 more things to note. The size of the circle in this diagram is an important feature because the wider the circles are, the more energy is required to achieve the situation. So if you look on the right, sharing is a smaller technical circle because it's you're reusing the same thing over and over, think a tool library, versus recycling, which takes a lot of energy to transport the materials, melt things down, and recycle them properly. So we want to create these loops and create them as tightly as we possibly can. And then one more thing about this diagram is at the very top, there's a little lightning bolt that shows renewables. And that is to represent that this circular economy is meant to function alongside the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So with all of these, creating these circles on the foundation of renewable energy, these can create solutions that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions over time. And so what do we need to do to accomplish this circular economy? We do need to look in all directions of the life cycle of all of the goods and products that we create. So looking to the past, where things come from, what they're made of, thinking about the present, how are we using these things? Do we actually need to produce more things, or can we use what we have? And then to the future, how are we thinking about where things go after they're done being used? So now you understand what the circular economy is. I want to give a few examples of what that looks like in practice. So on a very basic, on a product level, what does a circular product look like? I thought a milkman is a really great example that everyone should be familiar with, where the milkman or woman brings your milk products to your doorstep. You use the milk, they return the bottles and keep those bottles in circulation instead of recycling them or sending them to the landfill. So that's a really small, simple circle that you can create with just one product. Another example on an industry level is this company called Evernew, which is actually based here in Washington. They are creating circular solutions for a whole industry, the fashion industry. And so they have this technology called New Cycle, where you can take old fibers or old fabrics, say your bed sheets, old sweaters, socks, and recycle those threads into new threads that can be created into new clothing. So instead of just throwing your clothes in the landfill, they're actually repurposing all of that material and keeping it in circulation. And then even on a bigger scale, the whole country of Denmark, and specifically certain cities like Copenhagen and other major cities, are a part of something called Circular Cities. So that's an initiative to create circular systems on a larger scale where different businesses, organizations, stakeholders are coming together. And so Copenhagen specifically has declared that they want to have like a 70% recycling rate. So for context, Washington's about 50%, hovering around there for a while. So increasing recycling and then becoming a carbon neutral city. So that's kind of pushing this circular idea even further. And so a circular future, I put this just for levity. It might feel like something that's very far into the future, something like Wakanda, impossible. How do we get there? And it's not as far off as we possibly think. So what does it take for a circular future? These are 3 steps from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation of what their framework is for circular cities. And so what it takes is to design out waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use in cities and as long as possible to maintain their value, and then regenerate natural systems in and around cities. So we want to keep those local economies and keep those materials in flow. And so I want to talk about 5 opportunities very briefly on what kinds of things we could be doing with this Washington State Legislature. So this one is already in the works. Right to repair is a law that's currently in the legislative process. And the problem here is that most technologies, so think your cell phone, your laptop, your iPad, when it breaks or if there's an issue with it, the cheapest and simplest solution is usually just to buy a new product. So you end up throwing away your phone or returning it to the manufacturer. Instead, what Right to Repair is advocating for is creating services where small businesses can have the tools and information that they need to repair those devices instead of having to throw them away. So currently that's not really easy to do. There's a lot of constraints around it. So Right to Repair is seeking to remedy that. So this is something that's already in the works. So supporting this is one way that you can push the circular economy forward. And I put the bill number there in case you wanted to write it down and check it out later. Another opportunity is to really focus in on the industries that drive Washington's economy. So there are several ways that you can think about the circular economy. It's a very multifaceted issue. But if we focus in on some of the industries that really are big in Washington, we can find the biggest opportunities for impact. So I listed the top ones there: food and ag, aerospace, construction, tech, and then I added in fashion and textiles because we have so many retail giants here in Washington, so Amazon, Nordstrom's, whatnot. So all of these are great places to start. Funding public-private partnerships could be a really great opportunity where we can co-create solutions on both the policy level and the business level. So one can't really function without the other. It's really helpful to have policy to push businesses forward and businesses to push policy forward. So co-creating a solution is a great opportunity. And then also thinking about ways to design collaborative platforms, either material marketplaces or places that people can share ideas and lessons learned so that we can kind of keep that knowledge accessible to people. I have two more opportunities. Updating our regressive tax system. So later tonight, you'll be hearing about carbon tax and learning more about that. So I won't go into detail about it, but thinking about where the funds for carbon taxes go and what they fund is going to be a really great opportunity to advancing the circular economy. And then thinking about tax incentives. So if a business were to take on circular economy principles and implement them, take those savings that they might create or the jobs they might create with their solutions and figuring out ways to incentivize companies to do that. And then finally, this is a little less conventional, but I still wanted to mention it today because it's just such a big problem. It's interdisciplinary. So thinking about ways to teach the next generation how to think in circles. So circular design is not just a hard math, hard science type problem. There are so many different parts of pieces. There's economics. There's so many things to think about. So thinking about ways to incorporate this into public school curriculum and think about problem-based learning or interdisciplinary studies might be a great opportunity to go forward. So I just want to summarize all of that. Circular economy is a great vehicle for climate action because of reducing material flows, which will end up reducing overconsumption. And then the transition to renewable energy in partnership with that will reduce greenhouse gases over time. We can do that through a few ways: right to repair, focus on key industries, public-private partnerships, looking at our tax system, and then preparing the next generation. So that's all from me, and then we'll do questions in a minute, I believe. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Moji. Appreciate the presentation. And with that, we will just pause for about 30 seconds before I introduce our next speaker. Excellent. So our next speaker for tonight and our final speaker for the part one of our two-part series tonight is Peter Godlewski, presenting on business perspectives on climate change as an interested party. Peter is an association of Washington Business Director of Government Affairs for Energy, Environment, and Water. Peter has over 10 years of experience working in Northwest politics and has worked at the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association advocating for federal funding for infrastructure on the Columbia and Snake River system and Washington and Oregon's coastal ports. He's also managed the Yakima District Office for Congressional Dock Hastings with a focus on issues related to the Columbia River and environmental issues in the district. The learning objective here is providing a business perspective on climate change and some of the challenges between balancing business and environmental interests. Welcome, Peter. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to all of you who also have attended. This is my first time trying to do a screen share, so let's hope it goes well. There it is. Okay, I think that's working. Is that showing up okay? Fantastic, thank you. Well, I appreciate the introduction. As Gretchen was saying, I'm here to talk a little bit about the sort of business perspective on the climate issues. And I'm afraid after those uplifting previous presenters, I'm going to be a little bit of the killjoy in talking about some of the problems and some of the more tricky questions coming out of this discussion. So to start with, Association of Washington Business, just a little bit of a quick background. We are a business trade association. We represent all businesses in the state. We have members of individual businesses, but our focus is talking about the broader business environment within the state of Washington. So we're not here to advocate on behalf of one business interest or another. It's much more about the broader interest of operating a business within the state. So with that in mind, some of the just key points of climate that are focused with our members and that have come up in our conversations with the legislature. We're also based in Olympia. I'm sorry, that wasn't clear. First off is that carbon emissions are a global problem with a global solution. And I'll get into a little bit more about this later on, but basically this is a solution that crosses the local, county, state, and national borders. Solutions to this are going to have to be a lot more integrated and involve a lot more stakeholders than the smaller sort of focus that we might have already seen. A majority of Washingtonians do support a price on carbon. Clearly, there has been a shift in public opinion over the past 10 years where Washingtonians view carbon as one of the new externalities. From an economist standpoint that we heard earlier from Matt, the best way to handle an externality is to put a price on it, price it high enough that you don't want to use it anymore, and find ways within the market to drive down the price of that. Finally, and this is a sort of another issue that's come up, and I'm trying to stay away from jargon on this, but forgive me on some of this. It's just hard to get away from it. But the hockey stick principle, where basically you've got a line of the costs or improvements you're making, and then the last 20% or 15%, you see a sudden uptick in price. That's become a really big policy challenge as policymakers try to get to that last 20 or 15% of compliance issues. From our business perspective priorities, most of our members are in the position of sort of shifting over the past couple of years towards supporting some sort of price on carbon or a well-constructed carbon pricing package. I'm not going to say that's all of them. I'm not going to say it's going to become the position from the business community this session or moving forward. But there is sort of a growing awareness that with the support of Washingtonians, this is an issue that needs to be dealt with and managed within the state. Another sort of issue from the business perspective that is really important is the cost. And both the cost of businesses are paying to operate within the state, and then the cost that they'll be passing on to you, the consumers. Some of these are combined, some of these are a little bit different, but basically there has not been within consumer behavior on a broad sense, places where consumers generally have favored higher cost, lower in carbon intensity products. There's just been especially when times are tough, like we've seen in the past year, these issues have been driven really by prices of the raw good, and a lot of some of these proposals that are being discussed or policy recommendations would drive up the price of these goods. That is not necessary to say it's not a good idea or not something worth moving forward, but it is an important consideration. And finally, from our members' perspective, reliability of electricity. We saw down in California that what happened over the summer with rounding error and basically some miscommunication between the regulator and the utilities was a couple-day blackout. The cost for that ran to several $1 billion, both for consumers and for business. There are in Washington state industries that rely on reliable sources of energy. There are heavy environmental and safety risks should the power system be shut down. This is not just a matter of losing some product or having to rerun a production line. There are some industries that do require a constant feed of electricity that can have some severe impacts on worker safety and the environment if that power is shut down. So reliability is really an underpinning issue for our association and our members. This is a little bit of background within Washington state. Just to go through this very quickly. In 2018, the most recent year we have data available, Washington's emissions were about 99 million tons, roughly 100 million tons for the year. That's broken down into these sectors. Transportation is the single highest source. That is everything that runs, floats, flies, or runs on rails. So it's the single largest part that we haven't really dealt with within some of the policies moving forward, and remains to be sort of the single biggest driver of where we're going with the state and a lot of the policy discussions. After that is building heating, use of natural gas for building heating, and that includes water heating and secondary heating such as fireplaces. Energy generation, this is specifically fuel use for production of electricity. We passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act 2 years ago. That is actually dropping this. So this is going to be zeroed out or come close to zero, I should say, between now and 2045. And then finally, we have other. That's ag, industrial processes, waste management. This is split out over a lot more smaller groups as you get down, and represents some of the more challenging issues within the discussions around carbon pricing. Finally, we also updated our state greenhouse gas emissions targets. We weren't close to meeting the ones that we we had earlier on the books, but we still updated those last year. In 2020, we are required to have the same emissions level as 1990. That's about 90 million tons. And by 2030, in 10 years, we're supposed to be 45% lower than 1990, which is a total of just under 50 million tons. That's a little bit more than just taking every single vehicle off of the road in this transportation sector right here. That's a really big policy lift for the next sort of 10 years to work on it, and drives a lot of those concerns that we're seeing about cost and reliability. Finally, we have just the next two sections where we're just dropping even further to try to get close to a net zero by 2050. This is just a quick graph of where Washington's energy came from in 2019 from the Washington State Department of Commerce. We are a majority hydropower state. Followed that, natural gas and coal are both very high. Coal will be dropping off very quickly over the next 5 years and even closer by that 2030 with the closure of a couple of major fuel plants. Finally, nuclear. We do have a large nuclear plant in the state that provides enough power by itself to give Seattle its entire load. Finally, wind is a small percentage and solar is included in this other. So our renewable generation is still fairly low as far as the fuel mix. Now, some of that generation could be higher and it's shipped out of the state or sold in the market. So this is where Washington State's getting its fuel, not necessarily power that's generated within Washington. So for power, reliability, and availability, moving forward, we are concerned and data has shown that there is not enough electricity within the region to meet projected needs. We are currently expected to add about 1 million people in this state by 2030. Those people need heating, they need water heating, they need electricity, and they need fuel. Right now, there's just not enough capacity out there to meet those needs. And that's just with the current policies in place, including this sort of that we're calling the Clean Energy Transformation Act. I call it CETA in here, glide path downward. That's just where we are right now. In addition, we're seeing some push to what we call load shifting. This is taking one energy source and moving to another. Gas to electric vehicles is another big conversation. There is a tremendous amount of energy within gasoline that electric vehicles will have to be used on the grid. Additionally, electrifying buildings, taking them off natural gas and moving on to the grid also is going to drive some load increases. Finally, some challenges around new generation. CETA compliant market purchases, which is how you could make shortfalls up. California could have done that for their blackout. It's a little tricky under the policy. It's just there's a few extra steps and it's not as easy. There's a lot of talk about more renewables. Those do carry ironically, you need to have more base load. Renewables are an intermittent generation type of a portfolio where wind doesn't always blow, sun doesn't always shine. You need something to pick up that load when it doesn't occur. It's one of the weird little quirks of this industry where you have more renewables and you have more base load. Additionally, those renewables do have a high land use cost. It's more efficient to build a nuclear plant or a peaker plant out of natural gas in terms of the space used, in terms of acreage, as far as what a solar panel or a wind farm is going to need. And finally, there's infrastructure challenges. We need some more transmission lines across the state to move the renewable generation from the east side of the state to the west side, and those can take time to do. So it's just another sort of planning incident that's going to both drive cost, and again, if you don't have that power where you need it when you need it, there's reliability concerns. Natural gas.
We're at time here.
Oh,
so final thoughts. Yeah.
Are we done?
Final thoughts, and then we are going to move.
Okay, I will go quickly. The paradox I was getting to was we have some industries within the state that produce carbon at a very low carbon intensity because of the clean energy that I was just talking about. They are also exposed to high energy prices. As they move out of Washington state, they also close those factories down. Production then is increased elsewhere in areas that might have a higher environmental cost in terms of less clean energy grid. That's what we're calling what's called the leakage argument. So by closing down factories in Washington state, which has a clean energy grid, you actually might increase global emissions. And I can talk a little bit more if anyone has questions, but that's sort of become the paradox about that. I am sorry for going so long.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. And with that, we are going to move into our first question and answer period. And the first question we have is for Matt. This is from Cliff from Wenatchee and Lenny from Camino Island. This is a combined question. And since we are in proverbial uncharted waters with climate change, where do these different numbers come from since there's no precedent for this? Or what is the source of this data? Just hearing this and seeing these numbers and percentages, what's the rhyme and reason? Or are these arbitrary numbers?
Yeah,
And
thanks, Gretchen.
question responses as concise as possible.
I actually typed a response in the chat, and it basically said, I don't think the numbers are arbitrary. There are lots of studies of the costs and benefits. But one of the things I hope you heard from my conversation is it really matters what assumptions go into the study, because that really drives some of the results. And you can look at the difference in the example between the Obama economic analysis of the Clean Power Plan and the Trump economic analysis of the Clean Power Plan. And they're equally good analyses. They just have different assumptions about what the benefits and the scope of the analysis are. And it produces a different result.
Great, thank you, Matt. Next question is for Moji. This is from Barry from Bellevue. Circular cities sound exciting. What governmental agency will do the work? Private businesses, municipalities, state government? And how do cities get citizens and businesses to adhere?
Yeah, so there actually already are circular economy initiatives happening right here in Seattle. If you Google circular PNW, Pacific Northwest, there are already clubs and groups that are working towards this. So this can be nonprofit groups, businesses, and government stakeholders all working together on this stuff. So we need everyone.
Excellent, thanks, Moji. Next question is from Travis from Snohomish to Peter. Who are some of the business members of AWB and whose interests are being represented?
We actually don't represent or don't publish our membership list. Members are free to say that they are members of AWB or not, but it's not something that we generally publish. But as I said, we're broken up into a series of different policy areas and focus on different aspects within us advocating for those at the state legislature for the broader business community.
Thank you, Peter. The next question that I've got is from Gabe from Vancouver, and this is for Matt. Since selfishness and self-preservation stops most from acting for benefits in 100 years, how do we bridge that gap to convince people to act?
I think that's the question for you all, right? I think at some level, the conversation around mitigation on climate change has to be a conversation about what future can you envision, right? And since some of the impacts are starting to be now, and some of them will be a long time from now, you have to do some weighing of how much of that stuff matters. It's a hard question.
Great, thanks, Matt. The next one is for Moji, and this is from Chris from Linwood. When are we considered a recycle economy or circular economy? Do we need to hit a certain percentage that notes that we are in the next phase?
I would say no, there isn't really a threshold. It's more of the types of practices that we're implementing. So there's no such thing as a circular city yet. It's really just a concept and a goal and a target. It's more about incorporating all of those principles of a circular economy into the way that the city runs. So there's no real threshold. It's really just the way that you're moving.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Emoji. The next question is for Peter. This is from Angela from Vancouver. As far as Washington state emissions and reduction goals, it seems like we're headed in the right direction. If I'm understanding, you said we should be zero or close to in some areas in the future. Is there a report card per se that shows Washington state's current progress in these areas?
So the Washington State Department of Ecology will publish yearly updates about Washington's emissions and track them over time. They lag by about a year or so just because of reporting the data. Additionally, a lot of the bills we're seeing this current session are in reference to making sure that we're meeting that. So the department's website, I think, is ecology.com/GHG emissions, or if you just search Washington Ecology GHG emissions, you can track that. And they do a very good job laying out that pathway and Washington State's progress towards that.
Great, thanks, Peter. The next question is from Sue from Medical Lake, and this is for Moji. You mentioned that Washington is at 50% recycle rate. How is that determined?
Yeah, so I found that data point on the Washington Department of Ecology website. So they do, I think it's annual studies on the waste output of municipal waste, and they show you all the different categories of materials. And so the past 4 or 5 years, it's been hovering around 50%.
Thank you. The next question here is for Peter. This is from Gabe from Vancouver. Why isn't more nuclear energy part of the future equation?
That's not to say there isn't. The Clean Energy Transformation Act was energy fuel agnostic. They lay out what is a renewable resource. Under that definition, nuclear does meet that standard. It's more a matter of political will and interest. There's still a lot of concern about nuclear facility siting. I think Matt talked about some nuclear plants that weren't built in Washington for a variety of reasons. Costs are still high, and part of that is driven by just concern by the communities of which they'd be placed by. That said, there is some new technology coming online that might mitigate that. So certainly in the future, it could be another viable option.
Great, thanks, Peter. And this will conclude our question and answer for the first set of presenters. This is a question again for you, Peter, from Sue from Medical Lake. By the price of carbon, are we talking taxes?
Generally, yes. Mechanically speaking or functionally speaking, a cap and trade system or a carbon price system functional pretty similar to the same way. You set a price on how much you pay basically on your emissions profile. Whether you buy that from an auction or it's set by an external regulator, it's generally sort of the devil's more in the details in that. But it would be it is on sort of from that point the price on carbon would be the same thing.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Peter. And thank you to all the presenters. Really appreciate your time and for joining us today. And we are going to move into the second set of presentations tonight. Before we do that, if everybody pick your favorite stretch, stand up if you need to, recognizing you had a full day ahead of yourselves. You are coming here at the end of the day, and just do what you need to grab a glass of water, grab a cup of coffee, do your favorite stretch, and we will move into our next set of presentations in just a moment. All right, and this is also a great reminder that we up on the folder, the file sharing folder that Wendy shared with you, as we get responses to the questions to presenters that we didn't get to during our Q&As for each of the learning sessions, that document is up there as well. And as we get responses to them, we'll be posting people's responses. And we can orient you to exactly where that is in the folder as well. So we're capturing all the questions and getting them answered as presenters are able to answer them. So moving into our next set of presentations, the next presenter is Brad Warren, and he will be presenting on Price and Invest, which is cap and trade, and he's presenting as an expert. Brad leads the National Fisheries Conservation Center and its Global Ocean Health Program, which helps people who depend on healthy oceans protect their future from climate change, ocean acidification, and related challenges. And Brad also proposed and served on Governor Gregoire's Washington State's Blue Ribbon Panel on ocean acidification, among other initiatives to understand impacts, adapt, and reduce pollution. The learning objective that we'll be hearing from Brad on is about what cap and trade is and the pros and cons of using a cap and trade system to put the price on carbon to reduce emissions. Welcome, Brad, and thanks so much for being here today.
Okay. I think I'm going to need you to enable screen sharing at your end. It's disabled. Yeah.
Are you all set? Let us know.
I'm just testing it again. Okay, here we go. All right. Okay, there we go. So yeah, what I'm going to talk about really is not just cap and trade, but broadly cap and invest, because there have been serious proposals to create plans that have the same basic structure but don't involve trading. And the gist of a cap and invest system is that you use the money to fix the problem. The alternative to that, typically, if you're going to do carbon pricing, is you raise the price until it hurts enough that people improve their emissions, they reduce them. And Those two approaches are kind of competing strategies. People have a lot of different ideas about that. And we decided, working as we do with tribes and fishermen and other folks like that, hang on, let's go to the next slide, that they really can't waste time and don't have the ability to participate in a lot of political process. So we needed to steer them toward actions that make a real difference. So we dug in and looked at some of the options. These are some of the folks we work with. You can see in this the fishermen, mariners, shellfish growers, folks who typically who work on the water and are fundamentally they're frontline people. What's happening to the ability of the ocean to make dinner is pretty serious. And that's why we built our program. Let's see. In the big picture globally, of course, you've seen some of the numbers. We're now at about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent GHGs every year. About 3/4 of that is CO2. It comes from burning fossil fuels. That's not a mystery. In the ocean, there are a lot of effects. There's ocean acidification, there are heat spells, there are a lot of things dying from this. We're seeing, in 2015, we saw half the Columbia River sockeye die from meeting an overheated river when they entered the Columbia River. That says a lot. That's a big continental scale river fed by snowmelt. And it's not a place that should be hot enough to kill fish. We get toxic algae that also kill things. We get hypoxia, that's loss of oxygen in the ocean. As it warms and acidifies, we strip the oxygen out of it. We get sea level rise. We get a lot of effects. I won't go on with all the details. You've heard plenty by now. So the key question we wanted to look at is there a difference between these approaches? Can you get more performance, more bang for buck if you use one method versus the other? And what we found is yes, mostly. If you do a cap and invest where you use the money to help people become the solution, you get further. There's some caveats. No matter what form of pricing you employ, if it's just a tax and then you let people respond to the pain until they squeal and go green, or you give them money to help them become the solution. Either way, they're going to be complementary policies working with it, and those make a big difference. Some people think they make most of the difference. We're not persuaded. We think it does make a difference what you do with the money. It's kind of the point that Moji made. If you're going to have a price on carbon, you want to make sure the money goes to something that works, and we think that's really true. So these two models I just described to you, there's the revenue neutral model, which really is raise the price until people squeal and go green. It hurts so much, they put all the money they have into becoming cleaner. The other option is price and invest, where you give them money to help them become the solution. If you think that I have an opinion on that, you're right. We've noticed a difference in their performance. We think there's a difference in their equity. All of these models have equity effects. There are consequences to how we deal with this problem, just as there are consequences to not dealing with it. One moment. We looked at 18 systems around the world that are old enough to see how they're performing. They've got a time series essentially of 5+ years was the minimum we started doing this. And in particular, we found several that really tell a story. There's the British Columbia carbon tax, started in 2007, 2008. There's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative on the East Coast. I think it's 9 states, just expanded to 10, from Maine to Maryland. These are interesting to look at. Many people consider them kind of stars. You can also look at California, which is a similar vintage and has a performance you can evaluate. And people like these for different reasons. So we thought, okay, let's look at the ones that they consider to be really good and see how they perform. With BC, They managed to push emissions down by about 2% in the first few years, and then they started climbing. They were originally trying to get to 33% reduction by 2020. They're not anywhere near that. Now they're shooting for 40% reduction by 2030. Their actual emissions in 2018 were already higher than where they started. So you can make a case that a simple raise the price isn't performing very well there. And in some ways, BC has embraced that lesson. There's some recent actions in the last few years where they're investing some of the proceeds, and we may see a change in performance from that. I don't know. We compared here British Columbia, the RGGI states, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative states on the East Coast, and California. And here, their targets are shown on the left, and this is how far they wanted to get. And the RGGI system was seeking to get to 50% reduction by 2020. California was seeking to get to 40% reduction by 2020, and BC sought to get to 6% initially by 2012, and then 33% below where they started by 2020. They're now seeking to go to 40% lower. They haven't got there. Interestingly, California hit its 2020 target 4 years early, did so at a lower price. They're significantly more effective. And the same is true for RGGI. They're performing strongly at a lower price. The big difference, we think, is that they use the money to help people become the solution. We'll get into that. What they're doing in the East Coast with these states that are in this is they're raising money to put into things you can see in this pie chart. It's really important to notice that more than half of the money goes into energy efficiency. There's a ton of bang for buck in that. A dollar put into energy efficiency tends to produce a lot of dollars at the back end. You save on your energy bills. It's pretty obvious. You can put it into various other programs, some of which are clean tech and renewables, and they have all these things they've broken it out into. Some of it goes to help poor people pay their energy bills. There's a variety of measures intended to address economic inequality built into all of these programs. They all make attempts to do that. In a specific example of some of what's going on in one of the states participating in RGGI, in Maine, they reckon that their return on investment for the money they get from this program is $4 for every dollar they spend. Wyman's of Maine is a berry growing company with a cold storage facility. They got some money to increase their energy efficiency with cold storage, and they reported a lot of savings. The state of Maine's business community, which got some of the money, residents, people just with houses burning oil to heat their houses, got some of it. The businesses figure they saved $40 million in the first few years. Ratepayers in Maine saw their rates go down. Actually, they didn't pay more, they paid less. This is a policy, by the way, that's only affecting their electric sector. And so you would expect if they're going to charge you extra money, you'd pay more. What happened is that they got lots of cheap renewables. They got lots of cheap natural gas, which has lower emissions than the coal they were burning before. And they got lots of cheap efficiency. And between it all, their rates went down. So I'll go on to the next slide. The results in their region are calculated to be an awful lot of savings, billions of dollars in reduced fossil fuel imports to the region, thousands of new jobs doing clean tech things, putting up solar and wind and all that kind of thing. These are jobs that are local, not offshore, sending your money to, OPEC countries in the Middle East, where we have to fight wars to keep access to the oil. So it's become popular. Even the folks in the industrial community who were reticent about it have quietly more or less embraced it in most of that region. A major issue here in Washington State and many other places is transportation. It's a pinch point. If you want to reduce emissions, and essentially half your emissions come from cars and trucks and vehicles, moving things and people around, you've got to get at what it takes to help people become the solution there. And this people pay a lot of money. The energy burden for transportation runs around $2,500 a year for most people. I'll go on to the next thing. Higher fuel prices turn out not to be, you can raise the price of fuel by just putting a bigger tax on the carbon in the fuel. And it turns out raising the price doesn't make people burn less fuel. They burn the fuel they need to burn to do what they're doing. And when they have more money in fat times, they drive more. And the price goes up because it's fat times. So the price goes up, and you can see it here. This is Washington State fuel consumption versus vehicle miles traveled. They both go up and they go down together. They move in tandem with economic growth. When we had a recession in 2008, people drove less, burned less fuel, and when the economy recovered, they drove more. They kept burning more fuel going right up to 2008. That tells you that a higher price, and it got up to over $4, didn't stop people. It wasn't a factor. That's important. And you have to bear that in mind when you look at how wealth inequality plays here. One of the reasons we think that these price and invest policies that give people money to become the solution are working well is that you have vast wealth inequalities. Not everyone can afford to buy the solar system on their roof, the Tesla, whatever. And the reasons for that are, very well documented. We now have a country where 1% of the country owns, probably more than this now. This figure is from 2017, 2016. 1% at that time owned 40% of the wealth. The bottom 90% owned 20% of the wealth. When you have that kind of economic disparity, you have people who, just because you make them pay more for fuel, they're not going to be able to buy a Tesla. It ain't going to happen. And takeaways here. What you do with the money matters. If you use it to help people afford to decarbonize, they can, and they do. This is really one of the points that Moji made. I think she was right on. Complementary policies do, in fact, do a lot of the work. A key point that we looked at here is that there are complementary policies in all the places that we looked. Only a few jurisdictions saw really emission reductions where they were kind of hitting their targets. Those jurisdictions all use the money to help people become the solution. They do price and invest. They don't just raise the price and expect you to find somewhere in the bottom of your wallet what you're going to need. The others, frankly, it didn't matter whether they had a low price or a high price. They weren't hitting their targets. That's what we found. Inequities can occur in either model, whether you do price and invest or you do revenue neutral. Either way, there are real questions of fairness, not only about the future generations who we treat well or don't, but also about each other. Who we help, who doesn't get helped. One of the questions you get to when you're going to use the money to ease the inequities or to help people become the solution is who gets the dough. This is a pie carving process. And if you're a citizen and you think this matters and you want actual climate solutions, you kind of want to get to the table where the pie carving is going on and make sure that the things that are done are the ones that are really going to help and that they're as fair as they can be. So with that, I'll sign off.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brad. And we are going to pause between presenters for about 30 seconds before I introduce our final presenter for the night.
Brad, thank you.
Yep.
Great. So before I introduce our final presenter for the night, just wanting to acknowledge and recognize there are a number of models for whether and how to put a price on carbon. So tonight our presenters are exploring some of the important concepts. And with that, next we'll be hearing from Bob Hallahan, presenting on pricing carbon and the carbon tax. As an expert, Bob has a degree in natural science and a master's degree in national security. He's retired from the U.S. Navy in 2012 and began climate work by attending climate reality training in Chicago in 2013. And over the last 7 years, he's led the chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby on Whidbey Island. The learning objective here is what is a carbon tax and the pros and cons of using a carbon tax to put a price on carbon to reduce emissions. So presenting a different perspective. And then our two presenters will serve on a panel during the Q&A to answer the questions that you all are putting into the chat. And with that, welcome, Bob. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thanks, Gretchen. How's my volume?
It's great.
Okay, terrific. I appreciate the introduction, appreciate the invitation to be here tonight. My national security background is not the same as an economics background. I certainly listen to a lot of economists, and I believe a lot of what they have to say. I was given this objective tonight to teach about what a carbon tax is, and the pros and cons of using it, why it's going to be the essential and sort of obvious thing to do, according to many economists, is going to be one of my points. What to do with that money is important, and the case for revenue neutrality, I'll give you some of that, along with the ancillary policies on supportive and complementary policies, what we can learn from carbon prices in other places, and then a little bit of look about some of our difficult history in Washington State. And then I'm going to advocate that carbon pricing and environmental justice do go together, and they can help each other, and some recommendations at the end. The basics include understanding that carbon pricing is a market-based strategy for lowering emissions, the aim being to put a price on the emissions, an actual monetary value, so that the costs of the climate impacts are better reflected in our consumption. And why would we do this? It's a very precise and surgical policy that addresses the exact problem, which is too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And of course, I'm generalizing, but that is the carbon dioxide being the main problem for climate change. Making polluters pay tends to be a popular, fair, understandable concept to many people, and it harnesses widely accepted market forces. Without growing government, it does address all sectors unless you begin exempting them, and it influences investors' long-term projects when there's a carbon price on the books. And I do believe that is one of the economists' consensus policies. I had someone say you cannot even be an economist if you don't believe that pricing carbon would go a long way toward addressing climate change. The language really matters. In sort of casual use, say you'll hear carbon pricing and carbon taxes and carbon fees sort of used interchangeably, but when you get into the details of applying a policy, the differences become important. And taxes are generally used for funding government, and that word tends to be a red flag for a lot of our fellow Americans. So if you use the word fee, you're implying something that users pay, that they get something in return, and that other people can sort of opt out of. That's an advantage to using that term. You'll hear some people be very cautious about using the word carbon tax. The ideal policy here does start fairly low, and it rises steadily and gets high enough to be effective. And on those first 3 points, we've lost a lot of our time, whereas if we had instituted a carbon price 20 years ago, we could have small numbers here, but these first 3 need to be a little bit larger because we're late to the game here. Ideally, the carbon price is inexpensive to administer, fair, especially if combined with supportive policies, and widespread, covering all sources of carbon that are carbon dioxide. This does imply that it's best done transnationally, like Matt said earlier. The Citizens Climate Lobby advocates strongly at the national level for Congress to act, but we also have a lot of interest in state level carbon pricing. Importantly, it's not a good source of central governance funding, because carbon prices generate revenues that change as people's behavior changes. You don't necessarily want to tie the funding for essential services to a changing pot of money. Just like syntax of smoking tax or alcohol tax, those things change as they go up. People end up paying less of them, and the amount raised peaks and then goes down. Essentially, you really want your carbon price to be a popular thing. You want national buy-in, and so that you don't have a pricing policy change with every political change in the governance. Carbon pricing is broadly considered a market-based measure. These tax and fee on one side, and cap and trade also a market-based measure. You'll see these terms thrown about, and just keeping them straight. The regulatory approach is one that I'm not talking about here, but addressing carbon emissions through regulation is kind of the other big pie, the other big option. Does it make sense to do this at the state level? And I say yes, for these reasons. For one, it honors the urgency of the problem. Here in Washington, we have values which say we really need to address the carbon problem, the climate change problem. We see that the federal government is not doing it, and so it matches our values to come in here and put a price on carbon and address it. Puts pressure on federal government when lots of states begin doing this. States can be policy labs, and lots of graduate economists will get their PhDs studying the effects of various states as they tinker slightly different versions of a carbon price and see the effects. And all of this states does build policy momentum. On the other hand, a state like ours has limited ability to protect jobs. We don't want jobs fleeing the borders, going to places where from a high carbon fee to a low carbon fee. A national government has a much more expansive ability to do that through a border adjustment. Patchwork laws are hard on businesses. They don't want that. And greater bureaucratic efficiencies at the national level. And our Constitution has some limits about how the money is spent. A lot of discussion, a lot to be said about how to use the money, as we just heard in the previous talk. This was a 2016 study, Yale program for climate change communication. Clean energy is a broadly popular program among all Americans of all politics, and they broadly opt in for using money for that. As you work your way down the list here, you see returning money to households, which is one major approach that's being considered now. It doesn't poll well. 4 years ago, that has changed, and these same authors here last year reported that 2/3 of Americans said yes to this statement, that they support requiring fossil fuel companies to pay a tax on the carbon pollution they produce and using that revenue to reduce other taxes by an equal amount. So that would be a revenue neutral approach. If you want to do revenue neutrality, you have these two options, broad options, a dividend and a tax swap. The dividend would be you take the pot of money that's created by the carbon price and you refund it monthly, maybe, or to individuals. Or you can also alternatively do a tax swap, where you lower some taxes based on the amount that you can afford, lower some other taxes based on the revenue that's raised. The dividend approach has a really good, if anyone's from, I'm sure everyone is familiar with Alaska's annual dividend. It's a good example for how popular that is. And this makes the really good, it sort of brings it home when you talk about whether you want to have a dividend in your life or not. Everybody says yes, and getting there through a carbon fee is certainly one way to do that, and that's an element in creating the popularity of a policy like this. Supportive policies, in my caveman brain, I think of policies two ways here, and Brad talked about this quite a bit already, but supportive policies ease people's adjustment to a low carbon economy. So you don't want the carbon price to do all of the work, because that image of the poor family and the Tesla doesn't make sense. We know the goal is to keep the carbon price popular, therefore politically durable. You can do that with, these are some examples, reducing other taxes and working families tax credit, which is available in Washington. These two are sort of what British Columbia has done to be fairly effective and fairly durable. Displaced worker assistance is important. We don't have a lot of fossil fuel workers in this state. We have some, and we have families who send their workers to the fields in North Dakota and Wyoming. And so it is important to think about displaced worker assistance, protection for domestic manufacturers, again, broadly done on a national scale, easier, supporting solar and EVs. And I'm going to particularly point to Washington last year renewed the EV sales tax reduction, and I'd love it if the legislature reduced the EV registration fee to $225. Right now, people think of that as punitive. Complementary policies address climate mitigation in other areas. You heard a lot about that on Saturday. Phasing out non-carbon greenhouse gases is important in forestry and ag. And I'll refer you to Project Drawdown, which has done a ton of work in this area. This is from the World Bank. They track carbon price initiatives throughout the world. And one of the big takeaways is, to me, what happened in British Columbia compared to what happened in Australia. British Columbia instituted a tax that has been marginally effective, at least, maybe even more. And it stopped, the price stopped, which is maybe why the gains stopped, but the policy has spread across Canada. Australia, on the other hand, instituted a tax, a carbon tax, a true carbon tax that was not revenue neutral. It was revenue positive, and that money was used for other things. The government that instituted that about 10 years ago was voted out, and the policy was removed, although it's since been put back in place. Talk a little bit about elephant in the room here. So there's some tension in some green elements about a carbon price here, and 2016 was not a good year for our climate movement in our state for a few reasons here. But voters were presented with a carbon tax based very similar on British Columbia's law, and the fight became the story, and what was lost was the merits of the policy, and the policy did not succeed at the ballot box. And the Wall Street Journal here talked about the real question is whether to do something or nothing, a yes or no. And that's how they saw it. A lot of people saw it that way. In the national security industry, I talk about the strategic communications, strategic communication being maybe a message you didn't intend to send, but one that is received. And I think that our fight in 2016 sent strategically a message that maybe carbon pricing, maybe climate change is not as important as we said it is. That was a message received at least by the Seattle Times. They came out 2 years later, a similar initiative, equally deserving, in my opinion, of a yes vote. But the heart of the King County vote here, the paper recommended no. And they did talk about some of the reasons, but it had to do with some of that messaging here. Carbon pricing should not be controversial, and it remains a little bit controversial. So I want to encourage everybody to see carbon pricing as a tool in the box to get us to a more just world here. This was a study last summer that looked at carbon pricing in California, and it showed that the disparity between disadvantaged communities and other communities fell during the time of California's carbon policy, cap and trade policy there. So I encourage you to see it as an ally in the fight for environmental justice here. Decouple the mitigation from the side issues is one of my strong recommendations. Establish a price on carbon that is aligned with our neighbors, and simultaneously pass supportive and complementary policies. And importantly, include phase-out options. If the feds come in with a strong carbon pricing policy, then the state law might be redundant and unnecessarily harmful without any extra gain there. And I think that's about all I've got. I want to thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bob. And we are going to do something a little bit differently because many of these, both you and Brad bring a slightly different perspective on an issue. And so we are going to have a Q&A for this one. And we've indicated which questions are for both of you versus which questions seem like they're for one or the other of you. This first question is from Chris from Linwood. to Brad. Doesn't cap and trade just transfer the responsibility rather than actually reducing the emissions, like sending our garbage to China? It doesn't go away, you just transferred the problem.
Cap is really what lowers the emissions. And then you set a limit for each of the major emitters, and they have to hit that limit. If they can't hit it, they have to pay to buy pollution rights. And you make it by making them pay, it drives them further out of basically economic performance. And the further they go out of compliance, the more it costs them. No system I've seen allows simple transfer of all responsibility. Most of them set a limit on how much you can buy your way out of. And it's typically down in the single digit percentages of your compliance obligation. If you need to reduce 10 tons of emissions this year, you're not going to be able to buy your way out of all 10. You might be able to buy your way out of one, and usually less than that. People have anticipated that problem and designed for it. This is really one of the interesting things here is that you can design to produce controls on that kind of cheating and many kinds of cheating. Ultimately, people are incredibly clever at cheating, and they'll cheat any system you give them, whether it's a simple carbon tax or a system that doesn't price pollution at all, and they just get to dump everything they want in the atmosphere and the ocean, and nobody pays for it, which is what we have now. People game these systems, and they'll game it if you have a trade as well. So you have to be continually on the ball.
Great. And we have a lot of questions for you all. So keeping your responses as concise as you're able, given the complexity of the questions. So the next one is to both of you. And this is from Lenny from Camano Island. And it's a combined question from Lenny from Camano Island and Bethany from Warden. How do you ensure that a tax or fee on fossil fuel companies doesn't just get passed to the consumer? Bob, do you want to address that first and then hear from Brad?
Well, it's kind of the idea. The fossil fuel companies, as they bring the price in to the state, I mean, it will work its way through the economy. And what it'll do is it'll separate the two types, like a really dirty energy will create a high carbon price, and then a low carbon energy will have a lower price. And so you are seeing the pollution reflected in those prices there, and that is kind of the idea, to motivate change through consumer behavior.
Thanks, Bob. Brad, anything you want to add to that?
I think Bob got a big piece of that right. I think the other piece is that oil companies have not yet charged consumers for the prices they're paying, which are quite substantial under low carbon fuel standards. For example, in California, they're charged as much as $200 a ton, which is very high. It's a rare high price. And what consumers see is really a minuscule percentage of that. And I think that really comes down to their competitive position. They don't think they can charge that.
Thank you. Next question is also to both of you. This is from Chris from Linwood. Everyone is a polluter to some degree. So what defines who the polluter is and how much they are charged?
Do you want to take that, Bob?
Oh yeah, Bob.
Yes, everyone's a polluter. This is one of the advantages of a pricing policy versus a regulatory policy, is that people are free to continue to pollute, but they will pay the consequences for it. So this really brings in a concept of accountability that's very attractive to a lot of Americans. So like you're free to make that pollution, but it's not desirable. But you're free to do it. You're going to just pay the price for it. And then, ideally, you have supportive policies that make the cleaner energies more competitive or even cheaper. People will naturally move off. So that's, I guess that's what I have to say about that.
And Gretchen, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, we have a lot of other questions, so I'll quickly repeat it, but do you want to get to other questions? It says everybody is a polluter to some degree, so who defines who the polluters are and how much they're charged?
In the policies we've seen around the world so far, they set a threshold at big polluters and price those. And then those polluters pass the price on to their consumers. So big polluters typically start at 25,000 tons a year, sometimes higher than that. There are not that many facilities in Washington that emit that much. That makes it a lot easier to administer a program and a lot easier to measure and cost effectively regulate. That's the regulated sector. Everybody else is downstream and winds up getting charged at the gas pump.
Great, thanks. And this is a question for Bob. This is from Charles from Ferndale. How would the carbon tax be assessed?
This is a matter of the details that the legislature would do, but as energy is brought into our state, either from the ground or across electric lines, its carbon content can be measured. So methane and coal and solar and nuclear all have some carbon footprint, and that can be measured. There's people who do that, and then those companies, to get the license to do that, they would be required to pay the price per ton on that.
Great, thank you. This next question is for both of you, from Javier from George. What ways can some legacy investment to put towards the stability of our leadership so that the climate change crisis doesn't become a political partisan policy? Brad, you want to take that, and then Bob?
No, it's a great question, and I think probably a lot of people saw what happens when you don't maintain stability over the last few years. This is a good question for this group to contemplate.
Absolutely. Yeah, listen, I mean, that's been the root of the climate movement's goal for a long time. It's getting the buy-in. Like, we know the science. We've known the chemistry and physics for hundreds of years. The climate science is a couple hundred years old. Now we know the economics. We have enough information about consumer behavior. Just getting Americans to buy into it. What would be really nice would be like some giant outpouring of generosity and goodwill that sticks around for 200 years. Wouldn't that be great?
Great, thank you. Next question here is a combined question from both Robert from Bellingham and Pedro from Birch Bay. And this is for both of you. How is carbon pricing determined? Is it possible to use blockchain technologies to price and monitor carbon production in such a way that carbon would be priced and taxed simultaneously or instantaneously?
Do you want to take that, Bob?
I don't know enough about blockchain to move.
I'll say this: blockchain probably could be used for that. I'm not sure it's necessary. It's an extremely inefficient system for doing something that basic accounting tools do already. We might be able to do that without bothering with blockchain.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Garrett from Cle Elum. And this question is for you, Brad. After the last year, as many companies move to remote working, are there or could there be incentives for companies or employees to work from home, reducing the amount of transportation needed?
It's a great question and a great one for this group to contemplate. How would you design the incentives? How would you pay for them? It's a really good question, worth some work.
Bob, anything you want to add to that before we move to our next question?
Nope, next time.
Okay. This is a question from Sue from Medical Lake for both of you. Our state is so separated by the city side and the countryside. How is a statewide pricing better than countywide or regional wide?
So to that, I'll just say that it's more cost effective to do it on a larger scale. You don't want your administrative overhead to eat all the money. If you do this at a small scale, you wind up paying the people to push the pencils instead of to do the change in the energy system.
There's also quite a bit of expertise involved in measuring these carbon footprints of the various fuels, and a county wouldn't have the budget to hire the kind of expertise you need to measure something like that precisely. So, and the fewer the borders, the better. The more transnational you have a carbon price, the better.
Great, thank you. And this is also a question for both of you. This is from Gabe from Vancouver. if that happens in Washington, but not federally, won't companies just move, like all the companies that left California for Texas?
Do you want to take that one, Bob?
Sure. I advocate a policy that is in harmony with your neighbors, and ideally, we're on the West Coast. Reggie is a big region, so regional policy is better than individual state policies. But yeah, we're seeing one of the disadvantages of a state doing this. So if a state was trying to solve climate change on its own, I'd say that's not possible unless you're extremely wealthy and you incorporate lots and lots of those supportive policies. I wouldn't put the burden of doing this giant problem on just the price.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just the price. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that people have said if you price carbon, you'll break the economy and Granny will starve in the dark. And no place that's priced carbon has broke the economy and caused Granny to starve in the dark. It hasn't happened anywhere. California has a rather healthy economy last I checked. And, it hasn't broke them. There are consequences to our actions. That's true. Some of that involves the flight of those people who are not willing to perform to the standards. But sometimes you get businesses that are just as prosperous or more that come in because you're clean.
Thank you. And this is the final question before we move into our reflection period and our breakout groups. This is from Kathy from Auburn. The unfortunate problem with taxing versus helping is when the government gets the taxes, it runs off with the money for unrelated items, whereas you give people the money for the changes, it gets used for exactly what it is intended for. Our own state has a really poor track record. So what are the ways to address this?
You want to take that one, Bob?
Sure. One of the downsides of government using the money, and I didn't mention this before, is that government's going to hire companies to do these projects, and sometimes you're going to get a Solyndra, and those tend to be flashpoints, and they fire people up, and usually that's not the case, but people feel better with their own personal decisions on money than government, and that's kind of our culture right now, and we're the advantage of a national revenue neutral carbon tax is it takes advantage and works harmoniously with that American culture.
Yeah, and I think I would add that the systems that are working well have strong systems of accountability and transparency. And you can look and see where every penny and every dollar goes, and you can see the return on investment. You can see what kind of, like that pie chart I showed for Reggie, you can see where the money went. That's true in California too. And if you watch the results, people are getting things they seem to like.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Bob and Brad, for being here tonight. And with that, that concludes our set of presentations for the night. And we are going to move right into our breakout rooms. And those are the same around the campfire breakout rooms, same groups that we've been meeting with at the end of each of our sessions over the last few learning sessions. And with that, Derek, let us know when you're ready, and we'll move straight into those.
All right, folks, here they go. All right, Gretchen, we're coming back. Folks are coming out of our room, but returning from others still.
Great. Excellent. I'm gonna, as soon as Mike gets back, he's going to wrap us up for the evening. I know we're 1 minute away and we are committed to ending on time. So as soon as Mike gets back, I will turn
am back.
Mike. Great.
Great.
Take it away.
So thank you all. So again, just doing what we do at the end is just recapping today's meeting objectives. So today we learned from Matt Stewart about the trade-offs of the cost of climate change versus climate action, the cost of inaction or no action, and ways we can evaluate some of the upfront costs versus some of the future costs through the discount rate. We learned about what a circular economy means from Moji and some of the opportunities in Washington state to progress towards a circular economy. We've also learned about the priorities of Washington businesses from Peter and their role of climate change and the priorities from some businesses in the state. From Brad and Bob, we learned about a variety of carbon pricing models, including cap and trade, price and reinvest, and the carbon tax. And finally, from Bob, we learned about the history of some of the previous efforts of carbon pricing in Washington state. So now with one at the end, it would be great if you could post in the chat one word that you're leaving feeling today from today's presentation. So if you want to type into the chat and press, that would be great. And finally, just a reminder to please take a few minutes to fill out our survey. Again, this survey will directly inform a lot of the improvements and the adjustments we'll make from learning session to learning session. And this is just a reminder that this is your assembly and we are trying to be responsive and will be responsive to all of the needs from the assembly members. So with that, we're at 8 o'clock. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you to our presenters, and I hope everyone has a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. See you on Saturday.
Go Zags!
Thanks. See you Saturday.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
I,
Have a
Thank you.
wonderful rest of the week. Great. And I think we can go ahead and stop